The fluorescent lights in the attorney conference room at MDC Brooklyn hummed with their usual monotonous frequency, but for Nicolás Maduro, sitting in his khaki prison uniform, across from his lawyer Barry Pollock, everything felt different on this gray January morning. 3 days had passed since his arraignment in Manhattan federal court. 3 days since he'd stood before a judge and proclaimed his innocence. 3 days since the world watched him, former president of Venezuela, now federal prisoner, reduced to defendant number 26 CR 00847. But what Pollock was about to tell him would make those 3 days seem like a peaceful prelude to something far worse. "They're going to take the oil," Pollock said quietly, sliding a folder across the metal table. "All of it." Maduro's weathered hands, which had once signed decrees controlling the world's largest proven petroleum reserves, trembled slightly as he opened the folder. Inside were printouts of news articles, White House press releases, and internal Department of Energy memos that had been leaked to the press. His hollow dark eyes scanned the documents with growing disbelief, the stress lines on his 62-year-old face deepening with each paragraph. President Trump had announced it with his characteristic bluntness during a press conference at Mar-a-Lago, just hours after Maduro's capture. "We're going to rebuild Venezuela's oil industry. American companies will invest billions to get that oil flowing again. Venezuela has 303 billion barrels sitting there, doing nothing because of this criminal's incompetence. That's about a fifth of the world's reserves. Now we'll put it to good use." The plan was already in motion. Energy Secretary Chris Wright had scheduled meetings with executives from ExxonMobil, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and other major oil companies for later that week at the Goldman Sachs Energy, Clean Tech, and Utilities Conference in Miami. They would discuss contracts, investment timelines, and profit-sharing arrangements for what Trump was calling the largest energy infrastructure project in American history. "This is theft," Maduro said, his voice rough with anger, and something that sounded almost like grief. "This is colonialism. This is exactly what Hugo warned about. This is why we nationalized the oil industry in the first place." Pollock closed the folder carefully. "Legally, it's complicated. You're facing federal charges. Your government, or what's left of it, has been designated as illegitimate by the United States and 50 other countries. The U.S. is positioning this as a stabilization and reconstructions effort, similar to what they did in Iraq." "Iraq?" Maduro repeated bitterly. "So I'm Saddam Hussein now, and Venezuela is just another resource to be plundered. The legal argument they'll make is that Venezuela's oil infrastructure has deteriorated to the point of humanitarian crisis. That mismanagement under your administration caused production to collapse from 3.5 million barrels per day to barely 400,000. That American investment is necessary to prevent complete economic collapse and mass starvation." Maduro wanted to argue, wanted to list all the ways that American sanctions had deliberately destroyed Venezuela's economy, but he was too exhausted and too defeated. What was the point? He was sitting in a federal prison, wearing someone else's clothes, facing life sentences on multiple charges. His opinion on American oil companies operating in Venezuela didn't matter anymore. But something in Pollock's tone suggested there was more to this conversation. "What aren't you telling me?" Maduro asked. The attorney hesitated, then pulled out another document. "There's a proposal, unofficial, coming through intermediaries. The Trump administration wants you to publicly support the oil reconstruction plan." The silence that followed was so complete that Maduro could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. "They want me to what?" "Issue a statement from prison, saying that you recognize the need for American investment in Venezuela's oil sector, that you understand the industry requires expertise and capital that only U.S. companies can provide, that you're cooperating with the new government to ensure a smooth transition, and in exchange, your charges might be reduced. Instead of facing multiple life sentences for narco-terrorism, you'd plead guilty to lesser corruption charges. Maybe 15-20 years instead of life without parole. Your wife Celia's charges would be dropped entirely." Maduro stared at his lawyer with an expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. They want me to legitimize the theft of my country's natural resources in exchange for a shorter prison sentence. They want you to make this easier for them. Right now, you're a symbol of resistance. Half of Latin America is protesting the kidnapping. China and Russia are threatening consequences. If you, the former president, publicly endorse this plan, it gives the U.S. political cover. It makes this look like cooperation instead of conquest. And if I refuse, Pollock's silence was answer enough. Back in his 8x10 prison cell that evening, Maduro lay on his narrow metal bunk and stared at the concrete ceiling. His cellmate, a man named Rodriguez who was serving time for wire fraud, was reading quietly on the lower bunk. The small barred window showed only darkness and the distant glow of New York City's lights. 303 billion barrels. That number kept echoing in his mind. Venezuela's blessing and curse, the resource that had funded Chávez's revolution, that had paid for hospitals and schools and social programs, that had made Venezuela powerful and independent, the resource that had also attracted the attention of empires. He thought about the speech Chávez had given at the United Nations in 2006, the one where he'd called George W. Bush the devil, and talked about the smell of sulfur. Everyone had laughed at the theatrics, but Chávez had been serious. He'd spent his entire presidency warning about American imperialism, about the constant threat of invasion, about the need to protect Venezuela's oil from foreign control. And now, barely 13 years after Chávez's death, it was happening exactly as he'd predicted. Maduro's phone call with Trump, the one that had happened a week before the military operation, kept replaying in his memory. "You got to surrender," Trump had said, his voice carrying that strange mixture of certainty and impatience. Maduro had almost agreed. For several long minutes during that call, he'd been on the verge of accepting exile, of walking away from power while he still could. But pride had stopped him. The belief that Venezuela's military would protect him. The conviction that America wouldn't dare launch a ground operation to arrest a sitting head of state. He'd been wrong about all of it. "What are you thinking about?" Rodriguez asked from the lower bunk. "Oil," Maduro said. "The future. How everything I spent 30 years building is being dismantled in 30 days. You going to take the deal? The one your lawyer mentioned? How do you know about that? Come on, man. This place has no secrets. Half the guards are already talking about it. They're saying Trump wants you to do a press conference supporting American oil companies taking over Venezuela." Maduro was silent for a long moment. "If I do that, I betray everything Chávez believed in, everything we fought for. I become a collaborator in my country's colonization, and if you don't, I spend the rest of my life in prison. My wife goes to prison too, and they take the oil anyway. At least if I cooperate, Celia goes free. Sounds like they've got you cornered either way." The next morning brought news that made the decision even more complicated. Energy Secretary Chris Wright's meetings in Miami had gone better than anyone expected. ExxonMobil had committed $8 billion to Venezuelan operations over the next 5 years. Chevron had pledged $5 billion. Smaller companies were lining up with investment proposals. The total commitment was approaching $30 billion, the largest coordinated oil industry investment in a single country since the reconstruction of Kuwait after the Gulf War. Trump held another press conference, this one specifically about Venezuela's oil future. "These are the best companies in the world, the smartest people. They're going to rebuild Venezuela's energy sector from the ground up. New refineries, new pipelines, new technology. In 18 months, we'll have production back to 2 million barrels per day. In 5 years, maybe 3 million. All that wealth going to help the Venezuelan people instead of lining the pockets of corrupt dictators." The message was clear. This was happening with or without Maduro's cooperation. But his cooperation would make it easier, would help Trump sell the plan to skeptics, would turn conquest into partnership. Pollock visited again that afternoon with updated terms. The pressure was intensifying. "They're prepared to make this very public," the attorney explained, his expression grave. "If you refuse, they'll hold press conferences with Venezuelan exiles who support the oil plan. They'll parade former government officials, people who worked for you who say this is necessary for Venezuela's survival. They'll make you look like you're putting pride ahead of your people's welfare. Those are threats. Those are predictions. The Trump administration is very good at controlling narratives. What exactly do they want me to say? Pollock handed him a draft statement. It had clearly been written by White House communications staff and then reviewed by State Department lawyers. The language was careful, almost delicate, designed to sound like Maduro's voice while saying what Trump needed him to say. From my current circumstances, I have had time to reflect on the trajectory of Venezuela's oil industry under my leadership. The deterioration of our energy infrastructure has caused immense suffering for the Venezuelan people. Production collapsed not only due to sanctions, but due to mismanagement, corruption, and failure to maintain critical systems. Maduro couldn't read further. His hands were shaking too badly. They want me to admit I destroyed the industry. They want me to say American companies are Venezuela's salvation. They want you to provide political cover for what they're doing anyway. The oil contracts are being signed regardless. Your statement just makes their job easier. That night, Maduro couldn't sleep. He lay awake thinking about historical parallels. Mohammad Mossadegh, the Iranian prime minister who'd nationalized his country's oil in 1951 and been overthrown by a CIA coup 2 years later. Salvador Allende, the Chilean president who'd nationalized copper mines and ended up dead in a palace under siege. Muammar Gaddafi, who'd used Libya's oil wealth to challenge American hegemony and ended up murdered in a ditch. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Leaders who tried to keep their natural resources out of American corporate control ended up removed from power, sometimes through coups, sometimes through sanctions, sometimes through direct military intervention. The methods changed, but the outcome was always the same. And now Maduro would be added to that list. Except this time, they wanted him to participate in his own defeat, to publicly endorse the very thing he'd spent his career opposing. What would Hugo do? He whispered to the darkness. But he already knew the answer. Chávez would never have cooperated. Chávez would have gone to prison defiant, would have made himself a martyr for anti-imperialism, would have used every press conference and court appearance to denounce American theft of Venezuelan resources. Chávez's legacy would have been that of eternal resistance. But Chávez hadn't had to think about his wife facing life in prison. Rodriguez's voice came from the lower bunk. You say something? Just thinking aloud. About the oil thing? Everything. The oil, the charges, what I should do. Can I tell you something? From someone who's been in the system longer than you, go ahead. Pride is expensive in here. I know guys serving 40-50 years because they wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't make deals, wouldn't give prosecutors what they wanted. Some of them are heroes in their own minds. Most of them are just old men who missed their children growing up and their wives divorcing them. You got to decide what matters more, your reputation or your reality. The choice came down to a simple equation that Maduro kept working through in his head during those sleepless hours. Cooperate and face 15 prison 20 years while Cilia goes free, or refuse and both spend life in prison, while American oil companies take Venezuela's resources anyway. The oil was lost either way. The only question was the price of his defiance. On day 6 of his incarceration, Maduro finally gave his answer. I'll issue a modified statement, he told Pollock during their morning meeting. I won't endorse American companies specifically. I won't apologize for nationalization, but I'll acknowledge that Venezuela's oil industry requires international investment and technical expertise to recover. I'll say that I hope any reconstruction effort benefits the Venezuelan people rather than foreign corporations. That's as far as I'll go. Pollock shook his head. They want explicit support for U.S. company involvement. Without that, there's no deal. Then there's no deal. You understand what you're choosing? Life in prison for you and your wife? I understand I'm already beaten. They've taken everything, my country, my freedom, my dignity, but they can't make me legitimize it. That's the only thing I have left. The rejection of the deal was announced publicly within hours. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt held a brief press conference. Former Venezuelan President Maduro has chosen to prioritize his ego over the welfare of the Venezuelan people. While he sits in a comfortable prison cell, Venezuelans are starving. His refusal to support necessary reforms shows the same selfish decision-making that destroyed his country in the first place. The next day, the administration unveiled its response, a televised statement from Hugo Chávez, Maduro's former intelligence chief who'd pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges months earlier. Chávez, looking gaunt but determined, spoke directly to cameras from an undisclosed location within the federal prison system. "I worked with Nicolás Maduro for 15 years. I participated in his corruption. I helped him steal from Venezuela while pretending to serve the revolution. But I'm cooperating now because I see a chance for Venezuela to rebuild. The oil infrastructure needs American investment. Exxon, Chevron, these companies have the technology and capital that Venezuela desperately needs." Maduro's pride should not prevent Venezuela's recovery. It was devastating. Not because of what Carvajal said. Everyone knew he was cooperating with prosecutors, but because it showed how easily the Trump administration could generate the Venezuelan endorsements they wanted. If Maduro wouldn't provide legitimacy, they'd find someone who would. More followed. Mid-level officials from Maduro's government, people who'd fled Venezuela years ago, gave interviews supporting the oil plan. Venezuelan exile organizations held press conferences praising Trump's vision. The narrative shifted from American theft to Venezuelan-endorsed recovery. In his cell, watching news coverage on the small television mounted high on the wall, Maduro experienced something he hadn't felt even during his arrest: complete helplessness. They didn't need him. They'd simply constructed the political justification they wanted around him, using his former subordinates and government opponents to create the appearance of Venezuelan support. The oil contracts were signed in a ceremony at the White House 3 weeks after Maduro's capture. Trump stood between the CEOs of ExxonMobil and Chevron, flanked by Energy Secretary Wright and several Venezuelan exile leaders who'd been granted symbolic advisory roles. The president spoke enthusiastically about reconstruction timelines and production targets and American jobs. "This is about helping people," Trump said. "The Venezuelan people deserve better than what Maduro gave them. They deserve prosperity. They deserve hope. And American companies are going to help deliver that." Watching from prison, Maduro saw the ceremony for what it was: the culmination of everything Chávez had warned about, everything Maduro had tried to prevent, everything that decades of Bolivarian revolution had been designed to resist. Venezuela's oil, the foundation of its independence, the source of its power, the reason for its sovereignty, was now controlled by the same American corporations that Chávez had nationalized 20 years earlier. The cycle had completed. The revolution was over. The empire had won. Barry Pollock visited one final time to discuss the implications. "Your trial is scheduled for September. Without a cooperation agreement, you're looking at a very difficult path. The prosecution has recordings, financial documents, witness testimony from your own officials. Your chances at trial are not good." "How long?" Maduro asked. "If convicted on all counts." "Multiple life sentences. Effectively, you'd die in federal prison. And Cilia? Same. They're trying her separately, but with similar evidence." Maduro nodded slowly, his short gray hair catching the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room. His face, already marked with deep stress lines from 3 weeks of incarceration, looked older than his 62 years. "Then I suppose I made the wrong choice." "You made the choice you could live with. That's worth something." "Is it? My country's resources are controlled by American corporations. My wife and I will spend the rest of our lives in prison." "What exactly did my principles accomplish?" Pollock had no answer to that. In the months that followed, Maduro watched Venezuela's transformation through prison television and carefully screened news reports. American engineers arrived in Caracas by the thousands. New oil equipment filled the ports. Training programs for Venezuelan workers began under U.S. corporate supervision. Production numbers started climbing, slowly at first, then faster. Trump held monthly press conferences celebrating each milestone. Nobody thought this was possible. The president said at one such event, "But American know-how is getting it done. We're helping Venezuela while securing energy independence for America. Win-win. Beautiful deal." The opposition government that had formed after Maduro's removal, led by figures the U.S. recognized as legitimate, praised the reconstruction effort while carefully avoiding any discussion of the long-term control arrangements. The contracts granted American companies operational authority for 30 years, with profit-sharing formulas heavily weighted toward the corporations. It was, as even some American analysts admitted, an extraordinarily favorable deal for U.S. interests. But it was legal. It was internationally recognized. And it was permanent. Sometimes, during his rare phone calls with Celia from her separate facility, they would talk about the oil, about whether they could have done anything differently, about whether their resistance had mattered at all. "Hugo would be ashamed of us," Celia said during one call, her voice thick with exhaustion. "He'd say we let them win. Hugo never faced what we faced." Maduro replied, "He died as president. He never had to choose between principles and survival." Is this survival? Spending life in prison while they take everything? Maduro had no answer. The trial came in September, as scheduled. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Recordings of Maduro coordinating with cartel leaders, financial records tracking millions through offshore accounts, testimony from cooperating witnesses detailing the drug trafficking conspiracy. The defense tried to challenge evidence and question witness credibility, but the case was overwhelming. On November 12th, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Catherine Polk-Falia sentenced Maduro to 7 consecutive life terms. "You betrayed the trust of the Venezuelan people," she said during sentencing. "You facilitated massive drug trafficking that poisoned communities throughout the Americas. You enriched yourself while your citizens starved. These sentences reflect the gravity of your crimes." Celia received 3 life terms at her separate trial. As U.S. Marshals led him from the courtroom for the final time, Maduro caught a glimpse of a television in the hallway showing breaking news. Venezuela had reached 3 million barrels per day of oil production, exceeding Trump's ambitious timeline. ExxonMobil's CEO was being interviewed, discussing plans for further expansion. The revolution had promised Venezuela control of its own resources, independence from American empire, a new path for Latin American socialism. It had lasted barely 20 years before collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and the relentless pressure of American sanctions. Now, sitting in his permanent cell at ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, Maduro had nothing but time to contemplate how it had all gone so wrong. The oil was flowing again. That much was true. Venezuelan production was saving American consumers money at the pump, just as Trump had promised. But it was American companies extracting Venezuelan oil on American terms with American profits. Everything Chávez had fought for, everything Maduro had tried to preserve, had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt according to Washington's design. Sometimes truth really is stronger than guns or money or ideological conviction. The truth in this case was simple and devastating. Empires don't lose. They might retreat temporarily, might accept minor setbacks, might even tolerate limited defiance, but eventually, inevitably, they find ways to get what they want. Maduro had learned that lesson the hardest way possible, watching his country's resources claimed by the very power he'd spent his life opposing, while he spent his remaining years in a prison cell, forgotten by history except as a cautionary tale about leaders who believed they could challenge American power over natural resources. The oil would flow for decades. The companies would profit for generations, and Nicolás Maduro would die in prison, knowing that his greatest failure wasn't losing the revolution. It was believing he ever had a chance to win it.